Welcome. This is Lecture 17 in Communication 1110, Fundamentals of Speech. And you might be wondering what happened to the two lectures in between 14 and 17. Those we will take care of in class because they involve a lot of visual aids and some material like that. And there is a PowerPoint that goes with it, so you can just look at that. Earlier in the semester, we learned that communication has several components that go into the process, and one of those is channel. And channel has basically two types of ways of being done in communication. One of them is verbal, and the other is nonverbal. And you've probably heard the expression that 93% of communication is nonverbal. They say that in the movies sometimes. And really what they're saying is that 93% of the communication that has to do with our emotions and attitudes comes through nonverbally, through our body and our voice. But most of our communication, of course, is going to come from words and going to come from the ideas that we communicate through words. Chapter 12 in the book is about verbal communication, and this lecture sort of supplements it and goes a little bit deeper into some of the ideas that are in that chapter. Language study is controversial, and that might seem like a strange thing for me to say, but there are a couple of reasons why. First is that people who study language, and this would be people not just in English and communication, but people in the social sciences and even in some of the biological sciences, they're very concerned with how language has power and the power it has over people. How does it influence how we think? How does how we think influence our language? How does culture influence our language and vice versa? So there are a lot of concerns about the power that language has. Conversely, there's a lot of concern about how people who are powerful use language against other people. And this can be governments, this can be advertisers, this can be everyday people. And one of the ways that we use, and there are many, but one of the ways that we use power through language is through what I call euphemisms, or and that word comes from Greek, meaning eu is pleasant or good, and fem, meaning having to do with speech. If you hear of blasphemy, that's speaking bad against God. Well, euphemism is pleasant speaking. And as you can imagine, it's saying things that are unpleasant in a very pleasant way to sort of hide the meaning. For example, the government might say that they're going to have revenue enhancement. Boy, that sounds good, doesn't it? No, what it means, of course, is tax increases. So often people in power will use pleasant sounding words to cover what they're really saying. In wartime, sometimes we hear terms like air support, which to me means one thing, but what it actually means is bombing. Bombing sounds kind of negative, air support sounds positive. So you can probably think of some examples in your own life where this has happened. We often use euphemisms with children, of course, as well. Another way to think about it is the old saying, he who defines the terms wins the debate. Many times in political discourse and other kinds of discussions, people want to be sure that they are the ones who are defining the terms. They are the ones who determine what words mean, because then they can determine a lot of what will happen. A good example of this from history, of course, is the abortion debate, whether someone is pro-life or pro-choice. Nobody wants to say, well, I'm pro-abortion or anti-choice. They want to say what they're pro. And being positive is always better than being negative. So who gets to define the terms, who gets to pick the words is very important to discourse. I'd like to talk in this lecture about how, as a public speaker, you can be more effective in your use of words, and therefore, in a sense, more powerful, but in the right way, not in an unethical way. First, being clear in your language makes you effective and powerful as a speaker. And generally, you first want to use concrete words as opposed to abstract words. Now, in the book, there's an example of abstract versus concrete, and I believe that it starts the general word, the abstract word is physical activity, and then the concrete word is Kobe Bryant. And Everybody knows who Kobe Bryant is, pretty much. If you know anything about basketball, you've heard his name. He's very famous and very good. But if I were to use a name like Dante Cunningham, not everybody is going to have heard of his name, and so you wouldn't get the reference. On the PowerPoint, you'll see a picture I have of two statues. And the point I want to make here is that if I were to say art, everybody's going to get a different version in their head of what art means. That's a very abstract, general word. People are going to see dance, they're going to see painting, they're going to see sculpture, music, etc. But if I say sculpture, well, that's more specific. And if I say marble sculpture, oh, okay. And then if I were to say Baroque sculpture, I would probably lose a lot of people because they may not be familiar with the time periods of art and that particular time, which was after the Renaissance for about 100 years, 1600s. So I've lost people. I've gotten so specific that they don't know the reference. And then if I were to say Bernini's David, I'd really probably lose a lot of people. Now, when I say the sculptor David, most people think of Michelangelo's David, and that's what you see on the picture there in the PowerPoint. The other one is of Bernini's, and you can see that they're very different depictions of the character from the Bible, David, who killed Goliath. One is very Greek-looking and just standing there. The other one looks like he's about to kill somebody, or that he has just killed somebody. And these are very good examples to show the difference between the Baroque and Renaissance. But again, if you don't have the reference, it's meaningless to you. So you don't want to be so specific that you've made it unclear to people. The next way that you can be clear is to know the difference between denotative meaning, which is, of course, the literal, objective, dictionary-based definitions and meanings of words, and the connotative, which is the personal, subjective, and the connections that we make with words words and phrases. And you probably learned about that in high school in your English classes, but it's very important to communication because a word like car even everybody knows what a car is, physically they have a pretty clear picture, but the personal and the emotional, subjective, the connotative meanings are going to be different for each person. So, and the more abstract your words get, the more connotative meaning they have. For example, conservative versus progressive or liberal has a lot of connotative meaning for people, good, bad, or whatever, and but those are more abstract words. The third type of clear language you want to be sure to use or to be aware of is simile and metaphor. And these can be very good for figurative expressions. And you know that similes use like or as, and metaphors or comparisons that do not do that. But for rhetorical purposes, public speaking purposes, metaphors are always stronger. They have more of a kind of a directness to people and influencing their thinking. So, and this is kind of a common example, but if I were to say, he is a bear in the morning before he gets his coffee, it's more direct than he is as mean as a bear before he gets his coffee. So the metaphor, the first one, is stronger. The next one is cliches. And cliches are hard to avoid. Our language is full of them. We're not even conscious of how corny they sound. And I just used a cliche myself by using the word corny. And you want to avoid grandma talk, oh, he's as cute as a button. You want to avoid that kind of language. But you also want to avoid the athlete after the game talk. And you can think about that. After games, athletes kind of say the same thing. We gave 110%, we gave it all we got, that kind of thing. Also, along with the idea of cliches, is be conscious, especially if you're talking to someone from another culture. Their English might be impeccable, but they may not understand all of our American expressions that are based on sports. Many of our slang expressions that we don't even think about are based on sports of some sort. For example, we often say, oh, that's a slam dunk, coming from basketball. Or he hit a home run, meaning he was very successful. So you want to be sure that you don't use those expressions which are cliches because they don't communicate to everybody. Finally, in public speaking, as far as being clear language, you you want to use language that appeals to the senses. This is especially true if you have a ceremonial speech. I think the best example of this, and one we could study for hours, is Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. He has so many expressions and metaphors and sensory terms in there to just make you feel like you were there. For example, he uses heat expressions a lot, and it was a very, very hot day when he gave that speech, so he was relating to the audience in that way. The next point is that language should be a means of inclusion and identification, not exclusion. And this is one of the most important things that I say in this lecture. Language should pull people together. It should not push them away. Unfortunately, a lot of the language we use does do that. It's meant to push people away. What are some examples of that? Well, slang and profanity push people away in many cases, because slang is the idea that you're just, my little group knows this and nobody else knows what the word means. Stereotyping is a form of language that pushes people away instead of pulling them in. Another example is totalizing. Now you might say, I don't know what totalizing is. Totalizing is sort of the other side of stereotyping. If I see someone who is in a wheelchair and all I see is the wheelchair and I don't see that person as that person and in his totality, I have just totalized that person as a wheelchair. That's all I see, and that would be an example. Jargon is another type of specialized speech that is used in professions. If you're speaking with people who do your kind of job, that's one thing. But once you move out of that circle, don't throw that lingo, that jargon at them, because it's very hard for them to understand. Difficult vocabulary, or what some people call 50-cent words, is another example. And in both cases of the jargon and the large vocabulary, people aren't sitting there saying, wow, you're so smart. They're sitting there saying, why don't you use language everybody can understand? They're pushed away, not brought in. And then finally, religious terminology often is used in a way that pushes people away. And either it's very specific to that group, that religion, or it's cliches. So you want to be sure that you do that. The next point, Roman numeral 4, is that language greatly affects how an audience perceives a speaker's credibility. And I think we've already seen that in many ways. Audiences trust speakers who are vivid, respectful, and honest in their language, and who you can't take things two ways, who are clear about what they're saying. On the other hand, people tend to mistrust speakers who use some of the things we've already mentioned: slang, jargon, difficult vocabulary, stereotyping, and profanity. And you might say, well, there's sometimes when it's okay to use profanity or curse words or whatever, but I would say in most cases you'd be better off to stay away from them. Also, speakers who use uneducated language patterns, such as poor grammar or just getting words wrong in their meaning, will also have less credibility, and as well as speakers whose language is just not accessible. They use examples or humor that people just don't get, because again, people are thinking, you're speaking above me, you're talking down to me, these kinds of expressions. We also associate vague and two-sided language with lying. The textbook emphasizes certain rhetorical techniques that you should know for the purposes of the final exam and for your quizzes. And these are parallelism, antithesis, alliteration, and repetition. And you will find those in chapter 12. And he gives a lot of good examples of those. And they're basically based on repetition. And remember, speech is an oral, linear kind of communication. People need to hear things more than once. They need to be reemphasized. They can't go back. So you have to make it clear and clean and for them. Finally, I'd like to make some applications about language that will make you more effective. First of all, define your terms, especially if you have definitions that would be different from field to field or controversial or that people are vague about. These are called stipulated definitions. That's when you say, specifically in the speech, I'm going to use the word, and when I use that word, I mean this. You're just saying it. Nobody's in the dark about it. You're just saying it. And that's a good idea. When you do define terms, you should do it with not just saying whatever, this means blah, 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 but say, here's a picture. Here's a story. Here's an example. That's called an operational definition, where we can see it in operation. And that can be very helpful. Sometimes a picture also would be a good idea. Secondly, you should develop specific language. And the first thing you want to do is distinguish between an individual and the group. Now, if you're thinking, if you're with me, you know that stereotyping is basically not distinguishing between the individual and a group. You might meet somebody from a certain school and make a judgment about that person and then decide that everyone from that school is like the person you met. That's not distinguishing between the individual and the group. That's called indexing. Okay, if I refer to indexing, that's what I mean, not stereotyping. Another way is to specify the time and the place of behavior. If you ask me to write an evaluation for you for a job or a scholarship, I only know you in my class for the most part. So I can write, in my class, he or she did such and such. But I can't make a judgment about your whole life. And likewise, it's best, in the same sense, to avoid always and never. Always and never are two words that will get you in trouble, especially when you're dealing with your friends, your family members, your spouse, etc. Because when we hear always or never, it comes across as an accusation. You never do such and such, or you're always this way. And so our first response is to be defensive about it. So you want to watch the always and never language. Again, go back to the describing the behavior. Another way to avoid sounding dogmatic is to use I believe or in my opinion when speaking. Now I know that in your writing class your teacher says don't say that, but in speaking it's different. It's best to own your opinions and say I believe or in my thinking, etc. that way. And consequently, do not confuse facts with your opinions. If it's your opinion, state it as your opinion. Don't state it as a fact. If I were to say baseball is a stupid sport, that's my opinion, but I'm stating it as if it's a fact. So be careful about your use of is, and make sure that your opinions are opinions and your facts are facts. As the book points out, personalize your language. In public speaking, it's better to use I, we, me, you, etc. And again, I know that in writing, your teacher may not want you to do that, but in public speaking, it's different. Be sure, next point, that you do not assume co-meanings. That's called bypassing. This is true in speaking and conversations also. Many times we get into fusses with people and we just are using words to mean different things. We need to be sure that what I assume you mean is what you actually mean. It's important to continue to develop your vocabulary, but you don't do it to show it off. One of the main reasons to develop your vocabulary is so that you can read more difficult material. But generally, you don't want to just use big words to be using them in a speech. Keep your language, as the book points out, very clear and vivid. And the last thing I want to say is that, as the book points out, people get to call themselves what they want. Use the right name for groups of people. And we could go into a long discussion about this, but if you have any concerns, you can ask the people what they want to be called, whether it's a particular group, people with a disability or people with from a certain ethnic group, or check the internet for the example. But people get to call themselves what they want to be called, and don't feel that you're being put upon if you are asked to do that.